truth,
love,
and the good.
Here we go.
Welcome to the DTPHD Podcast. I'm your host, David Tian, and for the past 10 years, actually almost 12 years, I've been helping hundreds of thousands of people in over 87 countries attain success, happiness, and fulfillment in life and love. I'm joined by my guest here, Henry CHONG.
Yes.
Henry.
Hello. Hi, I'm Henry CHONG. I'm the CEO of the Fusang Group, and we help look after the assets and affairs of families of substantive wealth. And when I'm not doing that and making investments, I read widely and look at things like life, love, and the universe, and talk to people like David Tian about all of it, which is why we're here today. So
exciting. So we're here in Singapore for the second time we've done a podcast here in Singapore in the same room.
Yes.
And we're using one mic and one video camera, and we're recording this right after the previous one. We're supposed to go to dinner, but we're on a roll, so we'll just put out another one. So today, or in this podcast, I wanted to talk about the Android approach to life and learning, which is, so what I do is, broadly speaking, helping people with their lives. And for many, many years, it was focusing on dating. But it's been much broader now. So helping people discover their life purpose, discover their true selves, and finding freedom in life, freedom psychologically, and so on, freedom emotionally. And so we were talking about principles in the last podcast. One of the principles I was trying to figure out was what was underlying all of the difficulties people have in achieving success in all of these different areas, because it felt like it was the same difficulty. Yeah. And it felt like there was a cultural difficulty with it. So it wasn't just the people who came to me asking for help. They were actually far ahead because they actually knew that they needed help and that they were actively looking for it. Yeah. Many people in the world were much worse. They sucked at these areas, and they didn't see that there was a way to improve in those areas. So anyway, I was asking myself across the board, like, what's wrong with what is causing the difficulty in not knowing your life purpose, not discovering your true self? And it was very easy because I just asked myself, what was the mistake that I made earlier on in my life, and what was the main turning point that got me to the success now that people are asking me to help them? Yeah. And one of the most important, well, maybe the key turning point was the understanding of, the appreciation and the understanding the depth of what an emotion really is. So I grew up with the Android approach to learning. And I'll give you an example of why I call it the Android approach, because I was looking for a good way to encapsulate this point. Android approach. I used to call it robot, but robot sounds like Android is better. Here's why. Here's an example. Star Trek. Yeah. So the very first Star Trek with Kirk and Spock. Spock was the ultimate, like, he was like a superhuman being in a way, right? Yeah. Like he had superhuman strength, where he had strength that was far beyond the average human. And he was, most of all, he was the most rational, because he could suppress his emotions. And that was the pride that was the mark of a Vulcan, that they could suppress their emotions so strongly. And that made them ultra rational. Whereas, what's his name? Captain Kirk was a mess. He was drunk sometimes and all this other stuff. And in so most guys in the 20s haven't watched the earlier TV series. They've just seen the movies, the new movies that came out in the past 5 years or so. And those movies actually depict the relationship between Spock and Kirk differently from the TV series. When the TV series first came out in the 70s and 80s, it made it seem as if Spock was the ultimate being. Yeah. Whereas now and I'll show you why things have changed, but now we see that as a limitation. Yeah. But I think that lesson hasn't taken hold yet in popular consciousness. But anyway, so there's that first Star Trek where Spock and the Vulcans. And then you fast forward to Star Trek, the next generation. This is like 80s and 90s. And this is where we have Commander Data. Commander Data was an android. Yeah. And he was far superior to any Vulcan because he didn't have to suppress emotions. Yeah. He literally didn't have any. He was AI, and he was super strong and all this, right? So he was the ultimate warrior, ultimate soldier, and the ultimate scientist, and the ultimate everything. And through the whole 7 seasons, of which I've watched every episode, sometimes multiple times, he was looking for the emotion chip, because he had this creator, and the creator died before he could insert the emotion chip into his finger. And then finally, in one of the movies, he finds the emotion chip, and his whole life comes full circle, and he's finally a whole human being now. But all of his life is sort of like not Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It's Dorothy and the Tin Man, right? Looking for the heart. So same thing. So, and that was a theme that they put out in there in the season 1, episode 1. So you have now come full circle between modernism and postmodernism, where postmodernism is telling you emotions are really important and everything's subjective and all of that. And I think they went way too far on that. But there's an important important lesson that came out of that, which is that we actually are emotional beings. And if you approach life as if you could just suppress their emotion and they just go away, you're going to have a very unfulfilling life. But most people in the world, most men especially, are still approaching their lives and themselves as if they were trying to become androids. So the school system teaches you how to be an android. It teaches you basically to do math and science and read and write, and they do not teach you about your emotions. And the school curriculum was devised, that we're using now, basically the method of teaching in the early 1900s. You sit there in a class, and the teacher uses a lot of rote learning, and then you take that all the way through to university. And in university, you're not taught how to cry. You're not taught like how to explore your emotions. You're taught instead emotions get in the way, and you should be ultra rational. What happens instead, though, is that we suck as Vulcans. Like basically, we're trying to be Vulcans, but we suck at it. So we suppress all these emotions, then they come bubbling. They're always like bubbling underneath, and then they'll come out in ways that are uncontrolled and in ways that we're not even aware of, and they color a lot of our thinking because we don't understand them. So that's the android approach to life, and that's the problem. That people don't understand that they're driven by emotion and by automatic unconscious processes that they're not aware of. And they think instead that they treat themselves and their interaction with life as if they were Vulcans trying to become androids.
Well, let's take it a step back. So let me ask you, what is rationality? Like when you talk about Spock, right? And you say he's very rational, what does that mean? Like what is it about him that makes us say he's rational?
Yes, right. The idea is it's supposed to be a computing device, like a computational process, right? So emotion doesn't get in the way, so that you can make that decision whether to like a utilitarian decision, whether to save that one guy or to save the train full of people.
See, that's really interesting because there have been a lot of medical studies started. The most famous of which was Phineas Gage.
Yes,
he was this guy with an iron spike that went through into a certain portion of his brain, completely functional, right? So he could do math, for example, but he could not make decisions. Why? Because he had no more emotions. And I guess in a very basic sense, emotions or affectual, aversion, that's what gives us purpose in a sense. It shows us the things that we want or the things that we don't want. For you to be rational presupposes that you understand what the outcome you want is, right? So you say Commander Spock understands what the outcome he wants, and he's a computing machine that can compute how to get there. The problem is that first step of understanding which is the good outcome requires emotion. And someone like Phineas Gage, again, he couldn't make very simple decisions. If you asked him to solve a math problem, no issue. If you told him just make a decision about which restaurant to go to, impossible. Right. You told him again in the trolley problem: do I pull the lever or not? Do I save the people or not? He would impossible to make that decision. He could do the calculation, but he could not make a decision because he had no affectual, tagging, I guess, in that sense. So, I guess the movies in that sense have given us this false image that rationality and emotion can be separated, right? And this stems all the way back to Descartes, right? Cogito ergo sum and mind-body dualism, that the mind and the body are wholly separate, and they're not. Even in a physiological sense, they are intrinsically connected. Your heart and your brain have a huge number of neural connections, right? Literally, almost like having a second brain in your heart. Your gut has a lot of neural connections as well. Yes. So when you say I have a gut feeling, that really is your gut producing things like serotonin. I mean,
and we're just, we as in the academic community are really just on the cusp of understanding that, how the gut interacts with neurology.
Exactly. So you literally cannot have a thought without, again, we understand today that all thought is emotionally mediated. It's almost like a filter, almost like a photo filter, right? Where it changes what you see. Mm-hmm. You cannot have a thought without having a mediating emotion. You can have an emotion without having a thought, right? Because not all, I guess what we call thoughts come from the brain. Right. Your brain stem, right? Your what you call the peripheral nervous system can also make decisions independent of your prefrontal cortex being involved. Yeah. So like a lot of people are afraid of spiders. And when you see what you think is a spider, your body will react before you even realize that you've seen a spider. That's right. That is your peripheral nervous system reacting to something. And only later does your prefrontal cortex get involved and say, oh, it was a spider and that's why I jumped. So you can have reactions, you can have emotions to things without conscious thought, what we call conscious thought, but you cannot have conscious thought without emotions. Yes. People who, for whatever reason, have no more emotions find it extremely difficult to just live or to operate. And I think that a lot of ancient philosophers understood this intrinsically. A lot of the Chinese philosophers understood this. A lot of, again, the Buddhists understood this, that mind and body were intrinsically linked, right? That thought and behavior were the same thing. You can't separate them. There's a great book called Descartes' Error, written by Antonio Damasio. I think everyone should read everything Damasio has published. I recently just got two books by Damasio. They're on my bookshelf to be read soon. And Descartes' Error, Descartes' Error, I think it was published in the 80s. So philosophy really took a bad turn a bad turn in my opinion, in the Enlightenment period. So we can trace it back to something around Descartes, but you have that in Locke and Hume and so forth. And so Descartes is famous for thinking cogito ergo sum. I think therefore I am, and then creating a disembodied mind. And people thinkers started to treat themselves as if they were disembodied minds. And you're right, all of ancient philosophy in the East and the West never looked at it that way. We were always this like embodied cognition. We weren't just like our bodies weren't just conveyor belts or conveyance machines for our brains. And in the Enlightenment, it didn't go that. It went a different direction. It went into basically it created the android approach to life, or what maybe a better term is modern Enlightenment rationalism, right? And that led all the way through until that was the dominant view all the way through until the 80s and 90s when postmodernism started to become more prominent. And one of the things that postmodernism did was to say, look, you have emotions, you have feelings. Yeah. These are important. In fact, they're the things that are driving your decisions. So like you were saying, if you have no desires, you can't even decide between one restaurant and another. Yeah. In fact, all of our goals are driven by our desires. Yeah. So AI is going to have a problem unless we program desires into it, because it won't care either way. It doesn't have any. So it doesn't have any real goals that are intrinsically valuable to it. Exactly. I mean that is so. Right now we have what we call dumb AI or weak AI, and basically you give it a process and it executes on the process. Right. But it doesn't have, as you say, goals. And obviously, a lot of people are working on things like artificial general intelligence or strong AI. Right. But to do that in a very real sense, we will need to give AI something that looks very similar to emotions. Yeah. Right. It needs to be able to look at something and say, I like that, or I don't like that. Right. That is good. I feel that again an affectual, pull towards something. Right. Therefore, I should go explore why. That really is the difference between high order thinking and not. Yeah. So in a sense, the android doesn't even make sense. Yeah. Right. And so in the sci-fi movies, you have androids who basically, it's like when they say it, like the emotion chip for Commander Data, it meant that he didn't cry, he didn't feel sad, he couldn't laugh. Yeah. And so this was a very simplistic view of emotion, right? But he was driven by desires, self-preservation, of course, amongst them, but also affection for his crew members and all this. And you could say that, the idea in Star Trek was that his creator programmed those principles into his operating system. So basically we have to give them the emotions. So if he indeed programmed those principles into his operating system, he already had emotions. Yeah. So exactly. In fact, I think maybe that was the end of that movie. Like maybe that last movie where he got his emotion chip, he found out he already had it the whole time. Yeah. I can't remember now. But we don't see it that way, right? So we, as in popular consciousness about how we go about learning things. So one thing I see a lot that's very alarming in masculinity issue, like the masculinity industry, teaching men how to be men, because there's a big crisis right now, right? Is
to toughen up. So I got this shirt, Man Up. I have a show called Man Up. It was sort of ironical, but I don't think a lot of people realize that. Maybe it was too deep or something. Like, hey, man up, right? But it was like, we're talking about your emotions and shit. So, but really, there are some people who are like, just toughen up. Just pick yourself up and dust yourself off and get moving. And like, fuck your feelings, basically, right? And so I understand where that's coming from. That's how I've lived my whole fucking life, right? Fuck my feelings. Go and do it. And like the soldier's mantra, right? The military mantra. But something is really lost there. And where, let's say you have, the feeling is, I'm really sad, or I have debilitating feelings that don't allow me to move forward and do the job. So if the outcome is to do the job, then you want to treat your employee who's not doing the job like a fucking android, because you're paying for that. So you're saying, fuck your feelings, kid. Go and do that job I'm paying you for. However, if you're the employee, you want to really stop and ask yourself why you're having this feeling.
Exactly. Yes.
What are the unmet needs? Is it that you don't feel significant? You have no certainty now, or whatever. You actually got to do the psychology, because otherwise you're just shoving under consciousness. You're repressing, basically. You're suppressing, and then it will lead to repression of your feelings. And
exactly. No, I mean, you feel emotion for a reason. Effectively, your brain is trying to tell you something. Right? So again, interesting study that people have done about, you take 2 decks of cards, right? And you're supposed to pick from the deck that has a higher value. So more high value cards. They've been stacked. So one deck has all the high value cards, and you're supposed to keep drawing until you figure out which is the high value deck. People will have an instinctual reaction to the high value deck before they can consciously point to it. You can measure a galvanic stress response to the low value deck before they will say, that's a bad deck. Something in their physiology will go, I don't like that.
Wow.
Even before you can consciously compute it. So all of these,
a deck of cards.
Exactly, right? So physiological feelings, emotions, your body, your brain, again, and those are quite frankly the same thing. It's trying to tell you something, right? If you are afraid, why? There must be a reason. And again, Buddha said that, don't try to ignore your emotions, examine why you're having them.
Yes.
Now, having examined why you're having them, you may decide, well, okay, I'm feeling fear for this reason, right? For example, as hunger, right? The desire to eat 3 times a day is programmed in us for self-preservation, but in today's world, most of us don't really need to worry about getting enough food to eat. Right. You aren't actually going to starve if you don't eat even if you don't eat every single day. So sometimes you want to look at the emotion and say, okay, well, I'm feeling this, and I have decided that I want to feel the fear and do it anyway, or I want to push through. And then I think the second thing that's very important to remember is that just as thoughts are emotionally mediated, emotions are physically mediated, right? So a lot of people, we were talking about ego in our previous podcast, a lot of people say, I am depressed. It is my identity. I am a depressed person. Right. When the truth is, most of the time you do depressed, right? You are physically in a state of body that is depressed, just like you can do happy, right? We listen to, you listen to a happy song and you feel happy. And in some regards, it is as simple as that, right? And obviously there are lots of other things involved, but the way you speak, the way you move has a big impact on the way you feel. And I think that's a very important second step that people forget, that you can control your emotions through very physical means. And I think the third step after that a lot of people, again, don't really think about is that you need emotions to, again, not just for you to understand what your goals should be, but in order to carry you through to achieve those goals. We've talked about this in previous podcasts about how understanding why you do something is very important, because if you're trying to do anything significant, it's very hard. Personal change is hard. Building companies, it's hard. And for you to see it through, you must feel the sense of purpose. You must understand why you're doing that. And if you understand why you're doing that, you will feel an emotional response, right? You said, some people are told just get up and get going, right? Even though you don't feel like it, get up and get going. But that only works in the short term. At some point, you need something stronger to carry you through. And that purpose, in a very real sense, as we've been talking about, is emotion. It's that grit, that drive that says, you know what, this is hard and I'm going to push through anyway because I have something deeper that's driving me. That's an emotion too, right? A very again, I think a lot of people think that emotions are being happy or sad or cry, right? But drives are emotions. Just like, as I said, and the drive for self-preservation that you give an android is a real emotion, right? And if you've ever been in a situation where your life is under threat, I guarantee you that is a strong emotion that overrides everything else. And so I think the first thing that people need to remember, first you need to identify the emotion and figure out why you're feeling it.
Right.
Then you need to realize that you can control it. Right? There are very concrete steps, things that you can do to alter it. And you need to realize that you need emotions to achieve your goals.
Yeah.
Nothing else will ever give you the grit to carry through.
Yeah. Oh man, I love that. We're going to take that quote. What is it? Don't ignore your feelings. Find out why you have them, or why they're there.
They're trying to tell you something.
Yes, exactly. They're trying to tell you something. And then on that last thought there about what to do with it is that the goals that people set generally for what they want, like, so the things that they want in life, more money, maybe more sex, maybe more mating opportunities, more esteem from others. All of these are driven, these are all emotion goals.
Yeah, exactly.
But they think, okay, so if I want more money, I have to hustle, I got to grind, I got to work harder. But like, they don't stop and ask themselves why they can't experience the emotion now. So a lot of people I see on Instagram, on a Friday night, they're like hashtagging that they're working or something. I forget what the hashtag actually is, but they're grinding on a Friday night. This sucks, but I'm going to do what no one else does, so I can get what no one else can get, or whatever it is. But and they don't actually enjoy the process. So if they're not enjoying the process, they're not going to succeed. They're not going to last. And so one of the lessons that we've learned from many psychologists, including Tony Robbins, is that you can celebrate right now.
Yes.
You don't have to put off that gratification. So most Android approaches to life don't want you to celebrate. Right? So you're supposed to do your homework, and it's not supposed to be fun. But you got to do it anyway. And that's how people approach life. Like, employers set some task, and they got to do it anyway. And they think that that's the masculine approach. But what the masculine approach is actually take a step back and ask yourself, why aren't you happy at this job? And to really think deeply about that, because maybe you should find a new career or new calling. And but if you just put your head down and keep going at it, 20 years later, you're going to look up and really hate yourself. And so I guess what we'll end with, like, instead of the Android approach to life, focus on your feelings and figure out why you're having them. And then you had another one step was to identify the feeling.
Well, identify the feeling, realize that in many cases, feelings are things like they're physically encoded. You can change them. Right? You aren't depressed, you do depressed. Right? And I'm not saying that it's just as simple as changing a physiology. There are other things involved. But the point is, you can figure out what those things are. It is not an identity. It is just a set of circumstances that has created how you now feel. And third, I would say that you shouldn't reach for a life without emotion, right? Emotions are both what will help you drive you towards your goals. And as you were saying, they are the point, right? You don't want money intrinsically. You want money because you think it'll make you feel good. And the problem is that until you can first learn how to feel good, no amount of money will ever give that to you. Right? So if you have to first learn how to feel the emotion before you can go and chase other things.
I think the future is emotional intelligence, because everything else will be taken over by AI, and maybe emotional intelligence. Maybe we'll be talking to Android therapists later, but it's emotion all the way up and down. You start with the emotion. That's what you want. That's wanting is an emotion. And then you end with an emotion, the celebration or whatever. And then in the middle, there's emotion. It's all emotion up and down. So
if you can't, I think if you can't learn to be happy in this moment, you'll never learn to be happy in any moment.
So how to change your emotion in an instant. One is your thoughts. So that was the first thing, about identify why you feel that thing, why you feel the feeling. And that will lead you down the path of questioning those thoughts, or getting at the root of how to change, which thoughts to change. And then the second is your physiology, right? Your actual body, your physical body. You can, when I said celebrate now, you can actually celebrate as if you got that goal. It's both of those things. In your mind, you think, what if I had this goal now? What would I feel like? And then you actually do that thing with your body. Maybe you jump up and down, and you shout at the top of your lungs, or whatever it is.
And focus, right? So focus in the sense of, if you treat studying as something that has been imposed upon you as something painful, of course it will be. As opposed to you saying, well, I intrinsically want to learn something, right? And this is how I get there, and therefore, this is great. Yes. I have the privilege of sitting and studying so that I may learn something, right? I mean, everything is about framing.
Right, yeah, interpretation and perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So it's a good note to end on. Yeah. I'm hungry, gotta get to dinner. Thanks a lot, Henry, again, for hosting us here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Actually, technically, you're the host here. And I'll see you in the next podcast. Remember, there are two things. Join the private Facebook group, click the link, join the group. And the other is the show notes are available in davidtianphd.com/DTPHD podcast. And you can find Henry where?
You can find me on my website, I suppose, at henrychong.com. And I write a newsletter every Sunday. And you can sign up for that at fusang.co/newsletter, which is fusang.co/newsletter.
Yes, they can also find it on henrychong.com.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Awesome. Brilliant. All right, see you in the next podcast.
Talk to you soon.
Hey, it's David again. Before you go, a couple last things. First, all the show notes and links to resources can be found at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD podcast. Or you can just go to davidtianphd.com and find it through the top navigation menu. Second, if you'd like to interact with me or other like-minded fans of the podcast, then join our private DTPHD Podcast Facebook group. We've got an awesome community of intelligent, wise individuals from literally all around the world. You can send a join request to the group using the link you'll find in the show notes of every podcast at davidtianphd.com/DTPHD podcast. Click the link, log into your Facebook, and then click to join. We approve join requests every day. So go to davidtianphd.com and click the link to join. See you inside our group.